Hey, yeah, apparently the audio was really bad on the other ones. I can't stand to hear my own voice, so I didn't listen to it until today. So what we're gonna do is try this microphone, and let's retake Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and continue on this way with Rumblings in Remardan by me, J.S. Gholson. Yep. And this book 1 of the Congress of the Dwarves. Let's start off with the dedication once again. I want to dedicate this to my soon-to-be wife, Yulia Kuznetsova. Can't wait to make that Gholson. It wouldn't have been possible to write this without her inspiration, though I started writing this book because it was a lullaby to make her fall asleep, listening to my voice. I hope and pray that she will read it someday. Thank you for loving me. And of course I did make that Gholson. We got married back in October 2019. And on to the acknowledgements. To my parents, Laura and Randy Gholson, they provided me with incredible opportunities that helped shape this book. To my poker night pals, Marcelo, Matt, Sammy, and Brent, they knew I would write a book and looked forward to the audio of it, which I am trying to do now. To my good friends Gianmarco, Daniel, and Tom, who sat beside me on cold Moscow nights, making sure I wrote my page for the day. And especially to Gianmarco and my good friend David, who both were actively interested in my book series and encouraged me to send them chapters to read. And to the Ford families, Josh and Morgan, Sam, Jocelyn, and their parents and siblings, the oldest friends I've known all my life. Thank you guys. And of course to all my friends who believe that this would be a good book. I hope you enjoy reading it as much as I have. And let's start off with Part 1, Dwarves. Number 1, Chapter 1, Visions. That thick-set dwarf of middling height stooped, nearly bent edgewise, to the hard ground. The crunch of snow rang out as he hurried along the barely visible tract of a path, left by some animals, or monsters, or merely creatures nearly animal, yet not enough like them to count as one. His body was a mix of fat and muscle from working hard in the earth all those years of labor, and his oversaturating his tastes with the fruit of those labors. The voracious wind blew in gusts against his ruddy square-set face. His cornflake blue eyes were shining out of his skull. Those, in turn, were beset with rings around his eyes, dispelling to anyone about how much or how little sleep this dwarf had had. On his head, he wore an ushanka cap, which quivered in the howling wind. The cap seemed to keep his ears on his head, and his beard securely stuck to his face, though, from the look of it, that beard should be enough to keep his entire body from freezing, as it resembled the glowing embers from a blacksmith's fire, which had just been bellowed up into a hot swirl of orange flames, those flames which were ready to stick a bar of iron into it to form a dagger or a sword or some other not so benign instrument. These hairs on his beard protruded slightly out from underneath his ushanka, unwisely trying to escape. Being a bit younger on the dwarven scale, this dwarf did not have such a long beard like his elders. It was a ridiculous breaking of tradition if he kept it trimmed, and especially if he cut it, so his beard was shooting up like bean sprouts on his face with no clear direction in mind, yet covering every part which was necessary to cover. It wasn't the first, nor the last time he would be in this position in what could, typically, be a very long life for dwarves. The potatoes needed planting again, so there he was, in the early morning blasts of the cold wind, on a bright and welcoming spring day. Finally, the winter had ended, and Aneptius had a chance to check up on what, some might say, were dwindling potato crops. He went about his business with grim determination set in his face. Everything in the dwarf's countenance suggested that he hated doing this necessary work. Work. This was the real mind killer, he thought. Aneptius always felt the nagging fear that there was something greater he could aspire to and succeed at. The thing that always hit at his heart was the utter monotony of going out there every day to look after some tiny plant that would inevitably wind up on his table for food. It seemed almost like a waste. You spend so long caring and nurturing after something that cannot give you its thanks. For that ingratitude, it gets killed and eaten. Those damned potatoes deserved it too. So much time and long hours of hard work go into them, just for them to sit back and refuse to thank you for developing these things into fully grown individuals. Humans are like potatoes, ungrateful little things. There was a reason the dwarves were able to emerge from their mountainous dwelling places and sweep aside that barbarous northern kingdom. Aneptius swooned for a moment before falling aside as a vision of the past emerged into his brain. The tides of civilization could not be stopped once the dwarves had been let out of that sluice gate of history. What some might call the lesser races, those of humans, halflings, orcs, and even elves, though they were rivaled by the ingenuity of the lizard men, all these were thoroughly unprepared for the relentless onslaught of the short creatures from the mountain. And luckily for the dwarves, there were a majority of these humans in the north. No one saw them coming. Hell, no person really could, on account of them moving through secret underroads that they had created. The dwarves were much smarter than the others. They spent their long lives creating and refining the engines of war that were then used to persuade others from resisting too fiercely. The dwarves clawed their way out of the ground underneath the humans' capital city of Ostanovka. The rustic wooden buildings collapsed unto themselves, with the great hole that filled out in the center of the city. Once the dust cleared, there developed an oncoming force of short men clad in full armor. Dark plate and chainmail cuirasses reflected in the sunlight that they had barely seen before. The ranks of soldiers filed out in order to start their task of quickly pacifying the enemy army that started to realize they were under attack. It was easy enough for them to do. The element of surprise was following closely alongside these raucous beasts of steel which churned into the city. The humans stood no chance, but still, they tried to mount a successful defense. But it was a poorly coordinated effort, especially with their commanders at the lead. The humans hadn't faced any real threat inside their own kingdom's rise to power. Within the borders of the great northern woods and mountains, even higher up, no one tried to challenge the warlord who took over. Still, the humans had faced their own insurrections. The ruler quickly set about a task of using the army to crush down these rebels. So, even though inexperienced, they did have a little experience fighting semi-decent foes at least. The human soldiers tried to form up in their leather jerkins, gripping their spears and rounded shields with knuckles that cracked white from fear and waiting. None of these humans could believe that a part of their greatest city had just collapsed, in a roar of noise and shrapnel. The denizens of their city ran about in unparalleled numbers, with those doomsayers speaking their words into now open ears who fully believed and bought into whatever they were selling. It was a fulfilling and justifying day to be a doomsayer. The invading army of dwarves now marched forward, slaughtering anyone who put up resistance. There was really no one who could. Only the stupid idiot did not run away, terrified of what they had just witnessed. And so, the dwarves continued down these primitively cobblestone streets, towards where the terrified army was trying to hold their kingdom from falling apart. You could watch as these men were visibly shaking. The humans had never encountered something so fearsome in its might before as the dwarven war machine now was. Even the unison of steps of the troops created a thunder that echoed throughout the city. There was a swirl of dust that trailed lengthily behind the fighting force advancing to crush their enemies. Then they arrived to the field of stones that created a plaza right before the palace. This army would have been hilarious if it weren't so intimidating. A large group of what could have been described as fat children wearing armor would have appeared to the casual observer, except that the armor fitted their bodies snugly in all dimensions, and these were no children, but dangerous dwarves. Their axe blades shined dangerously in the noontime light. Arrows were let loose from the ramparts of the castle there, only to deflect harmlessly off of the shield wall that had now been formed by the invaders. There was seemingly no way of penetrating past that masked armored hedgehog, until a grand arrow, as long as a spear and a bit wider, shot through into the center, disrupting the order of troops who had gathered together to take the capital. Quickly the plug was filled with another shuffle of soldiers. The dwarves stomped onwards towards the lackluster ranks of humans that were almost scared out of their boots. Another one of the ballista arrows shot down and hit the dwarven ranks once more. The humans left their defenses to attack these little stunty creatures in that break, but they underestimated the dwarves. Then they were upon each other in the thick of battle. It was as if two solid walls had crashed into one another, in a desperate pursuit of cracking the other one down, except only one side was solid, and one side was desperate. The dwarves acted methodically in their precision strike swings against the barely kept together chainmail and leather jerkins that protected the humans. The dwarven steel made short work of the wooden shields as well, splitting those apart in each of their strikes. The human army did try to put up a little semblance of a fight to the dwarves. They reached their spears with such a force that was used many times during training to split pigs in half. But, unfortunately for them, these dwarves were no helpless pigs. If the humans were lucky enough and put enough force into their spears, then maybe they could land a hit that would pierce through the thick metal of the dwarven plate armor. Every once in a while, a dwarf would be slain here or there. However, there was no way that the humans could see any progress. The dwarven bodies were immediately dragged back and replaced by another one. In this manner, the dwarven conquerors went on to slay the rest of that enemy who opposed their march on the castle. Once people started to break ranks in fear, it was already too late, as the dwarves proceeded to kill those who tried to beat a hasty retreat. At that moment, it was especially easy for the dwarven force. But then, all of a sudden, a loud barking noise came from their right, as another gate was letting loose a multitude of rampaging dogs that were hungry for the taste of some dwarf meat. They charged forward, confident in their vast numbers, as a bolt of lightning was summoned out of the sky by a dwarven battle mage. It hit the ground right in the middle of the pack with an enormous crack from the heavens. Dogs screamed and squealed as some were set ablaze in the now unnatural noontime darkness. Still, the dogs came charging forward until their bodies were thrown up into the air with resounding frequency as they started to encounter the overlapping shields of the dwarves' iron will. It was a gruesome sight to behold. Dogs had to go for the legs of these soldiers in order to at least do any attempt at harming them. The armor normally succeeded in preventing those sharp fangs from getting too deep into anyone. But the dwarves struggled in their attempts to slice at these rapidly moving targets. Some more dwarven soldiers went down to this furious onslaught that no man could ever hope to replicate. The utter callousness that man's best friend now showed in their defense of their ancestral homeland was determined to rid themselves of these invaders. After a short time, the dwarves had managed to break this crowd down into its very constituent parts and begin with the next phase of action. They went about the task of demolishing the castle walls so they could finally reach the hapless human warlord who no doubt cowered inside. Engineers were called from the back lines of the force as the soldiery spread out around the city and the castle in hopes of pacifying those who remained. The dwarven support staff broke out into a fury of pencils writing down and sketching various things in order to best tackle this new problem of devastating the stone walls of the castle. Unfortunately, travel by the underroads did not support physically pulling out the large siege equipment from the hole in the ground. For this event, the dwarves were smart, and they kept them in the hole, those trebuchets which were so fearsome. The large, lumbering wooden and iron machines were rolled forward into the area to see the sky. The dwarves had prepared plenty of time to practice and refine their aiming skills in their first wars against the gnome menace. Long ago, long years of fighting with those gnomes had developed the dwarves' ability to figure out the trigonometry required to land their shots with absolute accuracy. That was exactly what was needed in this situation. The engineers took the precise measurements of the walls as arrows and ballistae were shot down at them. The steel body of the dwarven soldiers' shields held back the onslaught of these deadly weapons. Once they had reasonably taken their estimates, the engineers quickly withdrew back down into this artificially sunny underroad. They set to work varying the lengths of rope to just the right specifications that they needed in order to practically hit their target. About 300 feet separated them from those sturdy walls set up to protect that warlord. A large, round, cast-iron ball, the size of a tiny boulder, was loaded up into the back of the trebuchet as two dwarven workmen went about turning the spokes that tightened the ropes. The soldiers near the walls pulled back in anticipation of the coming strike. Then, the dwarves let loose bats to communicate between the front lines and the rear. There was a loud sound of the string snapping, and off went flying a large, solidly round ball from the cavernous depths. It went in a high, wide arc to land hard against the gatehouse with a thick sound, akin to that earlier thunder, which was called down. The stones set above the wide wooden gates blasted back as the rampart was thrown aside by this projectile. Screams were heard when the humans got crushed by this thing. The other soldiers up there quickly fled as one of their ballistae flew apart with wind from the released tensions in the strings, and the instrument destroyed itself, along with countless human lives. The engineers back in the hole quickly redid their calculations to find the exact right location to aim their war machines at. Again, the workers set to cranking back the large tendrils that held all of the stresses in that machine. When it was fired at this point, the large stone ball took flight once more, and absolutely pummeled the gates back into their correct positions, the position of a destroyed gatehouse. It took a great hit and fell apart, revealing the insides of the courtyard, which was still holding some men who refused to quit. The iron dwarves quickly marched in against those who still stood in their way. Those idiotic humans, who struggled valiantly against the dwarven throng, had their spears mostly bounced back off of the thick armor to cause no damage to those dwarves inside. The axes of them quickly found their ways of biting into the flimsy chainmail of the humans there. After most spear thrusts were blocked by the hardened iron shields, there wasn't much of an arm still holding that spear when they went to thrust again in most places. The lucky few humans who were able to block these axe strikes had their shields succinctly cut into splinters by the handy way the dwarves used their blades. A valiant few humans were able to run forward in order to divert the ranks of the dwarves, so that their friends could make it through the fight to escape. Those who did try to make that escape were shot down by fast-flying crossbow bolts from the dwarven arbalists still held in reserve. The rest of the stalwart humans who remained were shot through with the deadly tipped bolts as well. The dwarves pushed forward through the courtyard and easily rammed through the flimsy wooden doors of the castle halls. Inside was a carpeted, long, stoned hall leading up to a seat in the middle where the warlord of the north was sitting. Other courtiers were cowering at nearby tables, stuffing themselves with food before the inevitable deaths occurred. They expected to be slaughtered on the spot, and so they enjoyed the last few pleasures they had, a feast of fine foods. The man in charge wore several loose animal skins thrown about his sides in a supreme pattern of brown. He had gold dangling from his ears and head. His fingers shone through with that gaudy metal. When the warlord saw the dwarves had finally made their way inside, he said in an almost lazy way, "You've taken my capital. I guess you've come to take me too." A stout dwarf, with a long orange beard, shouted out, "Your lands are hereby seized by the great dwarven kingdom of Remardan. Your life is forfeit, and those who resist as well." The warlord on his now seized throne looked incredulous as a crossbow bolt found its mark directly in his heart. And so the dwarves moved onwards in what appeared to be their successful invasion of the north. That was chapter 1, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed this. If you did, like, subscribe, and share it, and look forward to the next ones. Thank you.